For any Ukrainian, I assume Bogdan Zinovy Khmelnytsky is what George Washington is to Americans, correct? Well, to Jews, Khmelnytsky is one of the biggest villains of Jewish history.
Bloody Khmel.
Pardon?
Bloody Khmel.
And the events of the mid-17th century, notice how I say the events, because as soon as you call them something, you are taking a position. If you are Ukrainian, you'll call this the War of Independence. If you are Polish, you will call it a civil war. And if you're Jewish, you call it Gezerot Tach, should be Tat. Tachtat, the persecutions of 1648-49. This is a classic example of how it's impossible to describe history without interpreting it. Just by calling it a name, you are already interpreting it. And of course, each nation has its interpretation. So, treading very dangerously, I will try to give my version of what I think happened here. And that is, Poland ruled all of Western Ukraine and part of Eastern Ukraine. The Polish nobles and Polonized Ruthenian, Ukrainian nobles, Polonized people like Adam Kisiel, owned the great latifundia. From the late 16th century on, there were, I think, 5 Cossack rebellions against the Poles, because the Polish kings would always promise the Cossacks that if they went out to war, they would be nobilitated, they would become Polish noblemen with rights, and then they always went back on the promise, and so the Cossacks would rebel. Each time, the Poles sent an army and put down the revolt. But in 1648, Khmelnytsky, who had his own problems with Polish authorities, did something that nobody else had done before. First of all, at the same time that he decided to organize a revolt against Polish rule, there was a peasant revolt against Polish rule. There had been peasant revolts before, but this time the peasant revolt and the Cossack revolt went together. In addition, Khmelnytsky forged an alliance with people who had traditionally been the Cossacks' enemies, the Tatars. So it was the Cossacks and the Tatars against the Poles. And these two things, the fact that it was a double revolt, Cossacks and peasants, and Cossacks with the Tatars, resulted in great success of the revolt. So much so that Khmelnytsky's forces stood at the gates of Lublin, in what we can call the heart of Poland, having basically conquered all of Ukrainian territory. But, interestingly, after that, Khmelnytsky retreated and went back to wait in Ukraine, because he wasn't interested in conquering Poland. He was interested in an independent or autonomous Ukraine, at least at that point. Okay, that's the big picture. Within that picture, we have the Cossack plus peasant forces attacking various cities in Ukraine, all the way up to southern Belarus, like Homel or Gomel. And who was in these cities? To a large extent, the city dwellers were Jews. And there were various sources of friction between the Jews on one hand, and especially the peasants on the other. You'll remember what I said about the arenda. If Jews were managing estates, who were they managing on those estates? Peasants, serfs. The relationship was not always a friendly one. Put on top of that traditional Christian enmity towards Jews and Judaism, and what is the result when the war starts? Massacres of Jews. Now, it's been a very complicated and sensitive question. How many Jews were killed? How many Jews were killed? You will read Jewish historians. For example, Menashe ben Israel, I showed you before, wrote in his little book that the Cossacks killed 180,000 Jews. Well, there weren't 180,000 Jews in Ukraine then. There was something like 40,000. So he couldn't have killed 180,000. He couldn't have killed 40,000. And it's not he, of course, who killed them with his own hands. It was various forces. According to the latest estimate of Shaul Stamfer, who spoke about it here, and I believe published an article, or is going to publish an article in your journal about it, he estimates that something like 20,000 Jews were killed in 1648-49. So, 20,000 is very small compared to 180,000. On the other hand, it's half. It's half the Jews of Ukraine. So, again, it's all interpretation, how you want to look at it. That half the Jews were killed, and the other half, most of them became refugees, although, unlike what happened after World War II, after things settled down, of the Jews left alive, many, if not most of them, came back to where they lived. And what's really interesting is that in at least two places that have been studied, that is in Pinsk, which is in Belarus, and in Dubno, which is in Volyn, the leadership, did I say it wrong? Oh, how am I supposed to say it? It's not, sure it is.
It is. I've heard Cleveland. I'm sorry.
Okay? I mean, okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So, in both places, and so I assume in other places as well, the leadership that existed in the Jewish community before 1648 was the same leadership that existed in 1650, 51, 52. In other words, people ran away, they preserved something of their wealth, and reconstructed communities very quickly. And the proof that these communities were reconstructed is, where does Hasidism develop? 80 years later, in the 100 years later, in the 1740s and 50s and 60s, where does Hasidism develop? In exactly these areas. So, this is a very big story in Jewish history, as it is, of course, in Ukrainian history. It also is the beginning of Jews turning westward, because not everybody came back. And we have another little war to talk about, and that is 1654, 55, 56. First, the Muscovite invasion, and then the Swedish invasion of Poland and Belarus, which of course involved also northern Ukraine. Again, Jews are in the way of these invasions, and many Jews run westward. The Jewish community of Amsterdam, the Ashkenazic Jewish community of Amsterdam, began with German Jews in 1635, but then was reinforced by, I'll call them Lithuanian Jews, in 1655-56, running away from the wars in what we would call today Belarus. So, I mean, they called themselves Lithuanian or Polish Jews. So these events had a big impact on Jewish demography and also Jewish mentality. The Gezerot, Tachtat, in Jewish psychology played a role that was only surpassed by the Shoah in the 20th century. Until the Shoah, there were two events that Jews thought about as the emblem of persecution: the expulsion from Spain and Gezerot Chmielnicki. Those were the two iconic persecutions. So, what was an early modern Jew? What do you think? What's the profile of the early modern Jew? I'm going to have to tie my shoe.
He was educated. Maybe.
Speak louder.
He was an educated.
Okay, educated.
No, not what educated like now we educated. Educated in the old era of he lives.
Yes, but we're talking about more democratization of knowledge, more opportunities to gain knowledge. It's not formal education.
I believe
Yes.
one cannot simply make a picture of an early modern Jew. There can be rather types.
Okay,
Of
typology.
Typology of what you were saying. Those people of big cities, or those of shtetls, or those of ghettos. And when we're speaking of East Europe and Western Europe, there is a difference, because if we're speaking of Russian Empire in the 18th century, after 1727, there was this precise territory where Jews were allowed or not allowed to live.
All right, Jews were never allowed to live under the Tsars until
Yes.
they conquered Poland. Okay.
So there is very, I guess, separate types of people.
Okay. Okay. So let's think about that for the exam. What the types might be. Okay. Now we're going on to our next subject. If the subject of our course, which is not that long, is conflict, I thought we should devote a little bit of time talking about conflict. So, Nadia, could you get... I need a different PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, conflict. One of the major scholars of conflict studies is a man named Louis Kreisberg. And here's how he defines conflict. A social conflict exists when two or more persons or groups manifest the belief that they have incompatible objectives. So, to have conflict, you have to have at least two people or two groups. They have to have incompatible objectives, that is, what they want to achieve, what they want to attain. Conflicts one with the other. They can't both succeed. At least it appears that they can't both succeed. And they have to manifest the belief. They show that they think that if you succeed, I can't. That's a conflict. What we might call zero sum. Zero sum. One of us wins, one of us loses. We can't both win. Now, in conflict studies, and I admit here I'm an amateur, I'm an amateur. This is not my field, so you have to weigh what I say. There is a big argument. Is conflict good or is conflict bad? There are those who said conflict is bad. Now these are the famous sociologists of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, mainly American. what's called the second wave of sociology. The first wave is Max Weber and Durkheim. This is the second wave. People who really put modern sociology, define what modern sociology is, people like Talcott Parsons, Elton Mayo, Lloyd Warner, Kurt Lewin, George Lundberg. They all said conflict is bad. Why is conflict bad? Because the overall objective of any institution or social system is functionality. Every social institution has a function. The family has a function. Raise the children. Feed everybody in the family. There's a function to the family. In order to fulfill its function, it has to be stable. If it's not stable, it can't function. A school has a function. In order to fulfill its function, it has to be stable. Government, same thing. All institutions in society, from the smallest to the largest, need stability in order to function. What happens when there's conflict? Dysfunction. Look at the United States Congress right now. They can't decide on who's going to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Republicans themselves can't decide. It's not the Democrats against the Republicans, it's Republicans against the Republicans. So it's conflict. And because of the conflict, the government's going to shut down. The United States government is going to shut down. That is instability. Conflict is bad. Breakdown. The United States government is going to break down because of conflict. So conflict is bad. That means we have to avoid conflict. And if we can't avoid it, we have to resolve it. But conflict is something we don't want. We work against it. We either prevent it or we solve it. But we don't say, oh, okay, go ahead, yeah, fine. So what if nobody gets paid? So that's, conflict is bad. But then the next generation said, oh, wait a minute. Conflict is good. George Simmel, Louis Kozer, John Burton, Louis Kreisberg. Simmel said, conflict is a form of socialization. Take a look at the family. Brothers and sisters fight like cats and dogs. There's constant conflict. What's really going on there? They're socializing each other. They're teaching each other how to live in society, how to get along with other people. In the end, there's give and take. Sometimes you get, sometimes I get. We have to compromise. You can't have your way all the time. And sometimes life isn't fair. So conflict socializes people. It's not only true in the family, it's true in the school, it's true in the army, it's true everywhere. Out of conflict, people learn how to behave. Social conflict has functions. It accomplishes things. Without conflict of some sort is the life of society. Where there's life, there's conflict. Progress emerges from a struggle in which an individual, class, or institution seeks to realize its own idea of good. Because somebody or some institution wants to change things for the good, it creates a conflict, and at the end, you get something better. People revolt against their government because they want to get a better government. In the absence of conflict, all you get is the status quo, no change. And the status quo always favors who? The people with power. The status quo always favors the strong against the weak. Conflict leads to the weak asserting themselves. With conflict, you demand justice. You discover the truth. It's the tool of the weak against the strong. It's a way to obtain what some sociologists or psychologists call basic needs. Now, by basic needs, they're not talking about food and clothing. They're talking about basic psychic needs, such as, first of all, identity. Everybody needs an identity. They have to feel that they're somebody. They can feel, I am a this or a that. Starting with sexual identity and going on to other identities, other components of one's identity. Secondly, recognition. Every person seeks some kind of acknowledgement that they exist, that they're significant, that they're important, that they have something to contribute. Everybody wants that. Thirdly, autonomy. People want to feel that they have power over their own lives. That they're not constantly being made to do things. They're choosing what they want to do. Next, equity. People want to feel that they're being treated fairly. Okay, I don't get everything I want, but the next guy doesn't either. But if they do, then that's not fair. Fifth, social capital. Social capital. That means, you know what financial capital is? You have money in your pocket. Social capital means you have status in society. You have a certain status. People respect you for what you are. You have authority. You have prestige. Just that you're students, that gives you a certain kind of social capital. And finally, sacred meaning. There has to be something in your life. It doesn't have to be religion. It can be secular. But something that gives meaning to your life. Something that you feel you would give your life for. Something that you believe in. Something that you stand for. People want that. They want to feel that there's something so important to them that they will sacrifice for it. So, identity, recognition, autonomy, equity, social capital, sacred meaning, and for these things, people enter into conflict. In order to get these things, they start conflicts. And that's good. Because these are basic needs. Everybody needs it. Everybody deserves these things. That's what this school of thought says. Conflict is good. So, then we say, well, if conflict is good, but is it always good? Again, let's look at the United States Congress. Is that good? So, they say, well, there's really two kinds of conflict. There's destructive conflict and constructive conflict. So, destructive conflict is bad. That is, conflict that leads to destruction is bad. But conflict that leads to construction, to making things better, to improving things, not just tearing things down, that's good. So that's the compromise. Sometimes conflict is bad and sometimes it's good. So, sometimes we want to prevent conflict, sometimes we want to resolve conflict, sometimes we want to manage conflict, sometimes we want to channel conflict. It all depends on the context. And how is conflict resolved? Well, often it's resolved violently, and then people get hurt. Sometimes it's resolved juridically, that is, people go to court, and without violence, the judge decides, and that's it. And sometimes there's something that people in conflict studies call ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. Alternative to what? Alternative to violence or legality. Then there are all sorts of ADR ways. And some people say Jewish history is a great example of ADR. Because Jews rarely had power. And in order to solve conflicts, they had to work around things and use ADR. And that's what we'll see in the few examples that we're going to examine. Now, there's a very important distinction in conflict studies, which has different names, but they're really talking about the same thing. Two types of conflicts, what some call objective versus subjective, or negotiable versus non-negotiable, or interest versus ideology. What are we talking about? If workers go on strike for a fair wage, that is called an objective conflict, or a negotiable conflict, or an interest conflict. Why? Because everybody agrees that people should be paid a fair wage. The only question is, what is fair? Well, that we can negotiate. That's something that we can come to some kind of objective determination. Given the pressures on the employer, and given the needs of the employee, and given the social context and the larger economy, and put everything in the hopper, and we negotiate. And we come out with what both sides agree is fair. That is an objective conflict that can be negotiated. But if you think that women should not be in government because God created it that way, that is non-negotiable. That is subjective. That is not interest. That is values. That is ideology. And there's no way to negotiate it. Or, I'll take a different example, again from the United States, guns. If you believe that the United States Constitution gave you the God-given right to have guns in your house, my wife is from Michigan. In Michigan, there are 9 million men, women, and children. There are approximately 18 million firearms. That means there are 2 guns for every single man, woman, and child. Okay? 2 guns for everybody. Now, since my wife's family didn't have any guns, you can assume that there are some people with a lot more than 2 guns.
Are you counting like hunting?
Yes.
Because
All kinds of
it's all
guns.
about hunting.
All kinds of guns. The point is, there are many, many Americans who believe this is a God-given right. The government has no right to take it away. That is a subjective, ideological, non-negotiable conflict. There's nothing to negotiate. It's our right, period. So, often in conflict studies, what the objective is to take a subjective conflict and make it into an objective one. If you can do that, you might be able to resolve the situation. You try to find a way to make it that it's not ideology. Make it into interests. Again, you have many examples of this in Jewish history. Where, just to give you a little preview, conflicts between Jews and Christians, which can start out as ideology, can be converted to interest. And I hinted at it before when we talked about the practicalities of church institutions when it came to dealing with the Jews. So that's, you would often take an ideological conflict and try to convert it into a negotiable conflict. Okay, another principle of conflict. Conflict is always embedded. That means there's never one conflict in isolation. Conflict is always an array of conflicts, a group of conflicts that are connected to each other. Conflict never comes by itself. It's always connected to other conflicts. And my time is almost up, right? Okay, I have 2 minutes. When we're talking about Jewish conflict in the early modern period, I want you to remember something about the context. The context is always, we're dealing with an autonomous minority community within a majority community. So, as a minority, they do not have power. If they seek to solve a conflict, it has to be ADR. It can't be through violence, certainly. And secondly, there is an assumption of insecurity. It may not always be true, but it's almost always assumed that our existence is insecure. And the saying I couldn't think of is kabdehu v'chashdehu. Respect him, but suspect him. Kabdehu v'chashdehu. Okay. And finally, when it comes to Jewish conflict, something very common is third-party intervention. That is, you have 2 parties in conflict, the third party intervenes. It's often a different Jewish third party. It's even more often a non-Jewish third party, like the government. So when it comes to conflict that Jews have either with other Jews or with non-Jews, you will often have third-party intervention. Okay, that concludes our first day. Tomorrow we'll start talking about Shabtai Tzvi. Thank you. Camera action.
I'm ready.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about religion in the early modern period. So, Jewish religion, as is true of Christianity and Islam in this period, you see development of mysticism. Most famously in the city of Tzfat, in the land of Israel, you have a very strong group of mystics, but not only there, in Italy, and then eventually, by the end of the 17th century, in Germany and in Poland, mystics. And of course, the culmination of it is, going back to the Jewish, beginnings of what I'll call the new Hasidism, which is very much connected to Jewish mysticism in the second half of the 18th century. And mysticism is also connected to pietism, that is, religious people who want to do something extra to prove how devoted they are to religion, to take the commandments and to do them in the most stringent way possible, to do them to just devote their lives to fulfilling God's will. On the other hand, we also have rationalism in this period, and again, it's not just the Jews, everybody. The famous rationalists, philosophers in the 17th and 18th century, and we have some Jewish rationalism in this period. But what strikes me most is what I'm calling Jewish syncretism. And that's, we go back to this edition of the Shulchan Aruch. You see we have pictures, again, imaginary pictures, of 6 different rabbis from 6 different periods and 6 different places. Right? We have Rashi from the 11th century in France. We have Rambam from the 12th century in Spain and then Egypt. We have Maharil from the 16th century in Prague, etc. What do I mean? Again, thanks to printing, Ashkenazic scholars now can easily learn what Sephardic scholars taught and the opposite. Whereas in the Middle Ages, you had a very strong Ashkenazic tradition in France and Germany. You had a very strong Sephardic tradition in Spain and southern France, Provence. The early modern period, everybody has to know everything. And everyone is influenced by what was written everywhere in the Jewish world. And again, the Shulchan Aruch is symbolic of this. That why does the Shulchan Aruch become accepted? Because it combines the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic. So it's what I'm calling Jewish syncretism. And here we have a picture from the late 18th century of a Hasidic couple to talk about mysticism and pietism. This period also, and if you read the chapter I asked you to read from David Ruderman, is marked by heresy. And three of the most famous heretics, Shabtai Tzvi, the mystical Messiah, who will be the subject of the lecture after next, his 18th century heir, Jacob Frank, who said that he was a reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi. In other words, he also thought he was the Messiah. And Baruch Benedict Spinoza, who was a heretic from the other direction, that is, ultra-rationalist, who wrote a very important critique of Judaism. The theological political treatise. Now, a very important subject, of course, is relationship between Jews and everyone else. Now, there's a famous verse in the Bible, Am levadad yishkon, that Israel is a nation that dwells alone. And this has been interpreted in many different ways and used in many different contexts throughout the centuries. Question is, what is the metaphor to describe the relationship between the Jews and everyone else? So for many years, the metaphor was conflict. That wherever the Jews live, there is either overt or covert conflict between them and the people among whom they live. That basically, they don't want them there, and they're only tolerated for how useful they can be, and if they're not useful, they're either persecuted or they're expelled. And for many years, this was the reigning metaphor. The Jews and non-Jews are always going to be in conflict in one way or another. Then, the metaphor changed, at least in history, historiography, writing about history. And in the 20th century, I would say that the dominant metaphor was dialogue. Scholars wrote about the Jews as if they were living in a host society surrounded by non-Jews and in dialogue with them. The Jewish society in dialogue with the non-Jewish society. Jewish society drawing upon its traditions in dialogue with the non-Jewish society living its traditions, and both influencing the other. In the last 20 or 30 years, a new metaphor has developed, and that is the metaphor of embeddedness. The Jews are not in dialogue with anybody. They are part of whatever society they're in. So, Jews in Germany are Germanized Jews. Jews in Yemen are Yemenized Jews, or Arab Jews, or Muslim Jews, however you want to say it. Jews are part of the societies they live in, and their connection to other Jews is analogous to Christians' connection to other Christians. But no more than that. So those are three different metaphors that have been used to write about Jewish history. And you have to understand, when you read Jewish history, when you read what historians write, they often don't tell you the most important part, and that is, what are their assumptions? What are the basic concepts that inform their writing? They don't usually tell you, well, I believe in this metaphor, or that metaphor, or the other one. They just write it. And you, the reader, have to understand, oh, this writer thinks that the appropriate way to describe Jewish-non-Jewish relationship is dialogue or something else. So you have to read critically. Whoops, what did I do? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of Jewish-non-Jewish relations in Europe, Christian Europe. St. Augustine, in the 4th century, defined the Christian attitude towards Jews. There's a verse in the book of Psalms, in Hebrew, Al tahargem pen ishkechu ami, hani'emo b'chelcha v'horidemo. Do not kill them, lest my people be unmindful. With your power, subdue them and bring them low. It's a verse in the book of Psalms. Augustine, and subsequently Christian theology in general, interpreted this to mean, do not kill them, don't kill the Jews. Don't exterminate the Jews. They should live. Why? Lest my people be unmindful, because if you kill them, the Christians might forget. What will they forget? What the Jews were witness to. The Jews witnessed Jesus. The Jews are witnesses to Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. So, the Jews are witness to Jesus. And if you kill them, you're killing the witnesses. So you have to let them live. But, with your power, subdue them and bring them low. That is, you have to show what happens to people who rejected Jesus. They saw Jesus. They lived Jesus. They were there. And what did they do? They were blind. So they have to be punished for that. You have to show what happens to people who refuse to see the truth. So let them live, but subdued, lowly, without power. And that is at least the official position. You have in medieval cathedrals these two statues: the ecclesia, the church, the synagogue, the synagogue. The church is a young, beautiful woman standing upright with a crown on her head, holding her staff, her cup in her hand. The synagogue is a woman with her head bowed, her eyes blindfolded because she doesn't see the truth. Her staff is broken, no power. Her cup has fallen from her hand. No material wealth. That's the relationship between the church and the synagogue. Jews are present in the great cathedrals of Europe. But how are they present? In statues and murals that show that they are the people who rejected Jesus and therefore are to be brought low. So there is a place for them, but not a very honorable place. But there is a place. Jews in the medieval times were considered servi camerei, serfs of the chamber. That is, there were serfs, who belonged to noblemen who had to work. Jews were serfs of the king, the duke, the prince, of his chamber. That means of his treasury. Their job was to make money for him. They were serfs who made money. And they belonged to him, which meant, of course, he had to protect them. On the one hand, he exploited them, but he also had to protect them. Privileges. including in the early modern period that we're talking about. The Jewish presence everywhere was based on a contract, which we call a privilegium, a privilege, a contract, where it's stated, Jews can be here, they must do A, B, C, they are entitled to X, Y, Z. In other words, what I said before, as members of the Jewish corporation, they have certain rights and certain duties. And this is laid out in the privilege. A privilege, as I said, is a kind of contract. Contracts can be broken. Contracts expire. And everybody understood that on both sides. There is also no shortage of persecution of Jews in various forms. Jews are expelled, Jews are massacred, there are blood libels, there are desecration of host libels, not every day. One of the most famous Jewish historians, Salo Baron, who is from Tarnov, I don't know if we call that Ukraine or not, he considered himself a Polish nationalist, I know that, but he went to America, so it doesn't matter. He was the first professor of Jewish history in a major American university, at Columbia University. He was appointed in 1930. He lived till the age of 95. He wrote an 18-volume history of the Jews called The Social and Religious History of the Jews. 18 volumes, he only got to 1650. In other words, the period we're talking about. And he's very famous for coming out against what he called lachrymose Jewish history. Lachrymose Jewish history. What does that mean? There was another famous Jewish historian in the 19th century, Zvi Heinrich Gretz, who said Jewish history is blood and tears. Blood, that is, blood flowing and crying about it. Suffering. Jewish history is suffering, persecution. And Baron said, look, it's true, there's plenty of persecution and suffering in Jewish history, but that's not the whole story. It's not even half the story. Most of Jewish history is not valleys, it's plains. And there are plenty of achievements. And I'll just say in parentheses, if you go to, I'm going to talk about this at the Art University, to the modern museums of Jewish history, like Beit HaTfusot in Tel Aviv, or the new museum in Warsaw. Anybody been there? Mm-hmm. You've been everywhere.
Not yet.
You'll see it's very much influenced by the Baron idea of Jewish history, that Jewish history is full of achievement. These are not sad places, these are happy places. They emphasize what the Jews accomplished, not what was done to them. That's there, but it's not, it doesn't overwhelm the story. The basic story is one of achievement, accomplishment. And that's Baron. So, there is persecution, but persecution is limited. And it's largely limited by practicality. Let's go back to what I was talking about, money lending and borrowing, okay? I said that there was a lot of lending to Jewish institutions, to the Jewish community. Now this has a political aspect to it. If I owe you 10,000 grivna, we call it, so I have a problem. If I owe you 10 million grivna, you have a problem. In other words, if the Jewish community is borrowing constantly from these institutions, including church institutions. Well, okay, St. Augustine, you're right, yes. But we have an economic interest here. We want our Jews to be healthy and succeed so they can repay the loans. So, if some priest somewhere is rabble-rousing and getting the masses to go out against the Jews and saying that there's a blood libel, the bishop is going to get into the picture and say, oh, wait a minute, let's calm down here. Often it's the bishop who will protect the Jews. Not always, of course. So there is practicality, and if it's true of church institutions, all the more so for secular authorities. As I said before, governments want money and peace. So we don't want riots against the Jews, because that's going to lead to riots against everything. And it's going to destroy a source of income. So again, you would be surprised at how much authorities try to protect the Jews. Again, not always, but certainly to a significant extent. Now, in the early modern period, what I hinted at before, that is new philosophical ideas that have nothing to do with the Jews, have implications for Christian-Jewish relations. So, let's take these three gentlemen. John Locke, René Descartes, and once more, Baruch Benedict Spinoza. Okay, Descartes. What's the famous sentence Descartes is known for? I can't hear you. I think, therefore I am, right? Now that was the answer to a question. What was the question? What was the question? I can't hear you.
It's a famous work of Descartes.
That's a famous saying, but with that saying, I think, therefore I am, was the answer to a question. What was the question?
What is real? What is real?
Okay, I would put it a different way. How do I know I exist? Okay? How do I know I'm real? How do I know I exist? Now this is an example of what we call radical skepticism. Radical skepticism. I question everything. Even my own existence I question. Everything is in doubt. Everything must be proven. I accept nothing on authority. I accept nothing because somebody told me. My parents told me I exist. That's not good enough. I have to prove, even to myself, that I exist. That's radical skepticism. Everything is in doubt. Well, if everything's in doubt, so is St. Augustine. So is the traditional attitude toward the Jews. Maybe the Jews aren't so bad. And as John Locke said, everybody is equal, except black people. Well, if everybody's equal, maybe the Jews are equal. I don't care what the church says. I have to look at this question independently. And there are new secularizing trends. The state should not be in the service of the church. The state has its own interests, which are different from the church's interests. Maybe the state should use the Jews differently from the way the church says. And that will better serve the state's interest. So maybe we should change our attitude toward the Jews. So there are new ideas that have implications for how we relate to the Jews. But there are also new ideas, new reasons to hate the Jews. And the person who came up with these reasons was a Jew, Mr. Spinoza. If in the Middle Ages, the problem of the Jews was, or the problem with the Jews was that they did not accept Christianity. It was a religious problem. They were the enemies of Christianity. Okay, in the secular age, we don't care about that. We're also enemies of Christianity. We rationalists, we deists, we don't care about Christianity. But that's not the problem with the Jews, says Spinoza. The problem with the Jews is they hate everybody. They're not the enemies of Christianity, they're the enemies of civilization. So Spinoza laid the foundation for a new kind of Jew hatred, for a secular Jew hatred. Jews have proven they cannot be part of civilization. They just can't. It's got nothing to do with religion. They just refuse to be part of everybody else. Well, that laid the foundation for a secular kind of Jew hatred, which eventually becomes anti-Semitism. So in this period, we have both the foundation for tolerance of the Jews, a new tolerance, and a new hatred. Now, of course, Jews don't take this in silence. Already in the 17th century, we have Jews responding in non-Jewish languages to these ideas. 3 books came out in the 17th century, written in European languages, not Hebrew, not Yiddish, but Italian, English, and Spanish. Italian, English, and Spanish. Simona di Luzzatto, as you can see, an Italian Jew, in Hebrew, Simcha Luzzatto. In response to anti-Jewish propaganda in the late 1630s in Venice, wrote a book about the virtues of the Jews in Italian. Many of the themes of Luzzatto's book was picked up by this gentleman, who was probably a schoolmate of Spinoza in the Hebrew school of Amsterdam. They were contemporaries, both of them from Marano families who had returned to Judaism in Amsterdam, both born around the same time, except that Menashe ben Israel became a rabbi and a printer. He was very important in printing books that Iberian Jews coming back to Judaism could read in Portuguese or in Spanish, Jewish books. Sort of like, if any of you know, the Aliyah library in Israel, books in Russian for Russian-speaking Jews who came to Israel to become familiar with classics of Jewish culture. So he did the same thing in Spanish and Portuguese. But he's most famous for trying to persuade Oliver Cromwell and the English elites to readmit the Jews to England, from which they had been expelled, as I told you, if you can remember, a few hours ago, in 1290. In 1655, to readmit the Jews. And as part of his effort to do so, he wrote this little book in English, The Humble Addresses, in which he borrowed a lot from Luzzatto. And he said, look, everywhere we look, the Jews are great. First of all, everywhere, they are loyal politically. They have no political aspirations. If you let Jews into your country, they will love you. They will be loyal to you. They will never rebel against you. They will never work for some enemy. They're yours. That's number one. Number two, the Jews are useful. Wherever they go, they improve the economy. What more do you want? They help you, business. There's a place in the Alps, right across the Austrian border, in Austria, across from Switzerland. It's called Hohenems, Hohenems. And in this period, in the 16th century, the Duke of Hohenems decided he was going to put his little town that's situated in the Alps, a beautiful, Austrian Alp scene, he's going to put it on the map. He did two things. He invited an Italian architect to build his palace, and he invited 12 Jewish families to do business. In the end, in Hohenems, there are two main streets, Jew Street and Christian Street. Where else in Europe is there a Christian street? Anyway, so Menashe ben Israel says, the Jews are useful. And finally, the Jews have noble character. They're nice people. And then we have this gentleman, Isaac Cardozo, who was born in Spain as a new Christian, was a doctor to the royal court, gave it all up, and moved to Italy, to the ghetto of Verona, where he was a doctor to the Jews of Verona. From the Spanish court to the Italian ghetto, because he wanted to go back to being Jewish. Okay, Isaac Cardozo wrote a book in Spanish, Las Excelencias de los Hebreos, the excellencies of the Jews. And he went one step further than Luzzatto and Menashe ben Israel. He said, look, it's obvious. The Jews are the best people. That's it. So, this is 17th century, new philosophical climate, people ready for new ideas about the Jews. These Jews are trying to convince, not other Jews, non-Jews, they're writing in non-Jewish languages, that, hey, let's change toward the Jews. Now, what do the Jews think about the Christians? So, there's a saying in Hebrew. I can't think of it. I'll think of it. Anyway, in English, it's respect but suspect. Respect but suspect. You can never be sure. Can we take yes for an answer from the non-Jews? Can we take yes for an answer? Secondly, when it comes to relationship with non-Jews, Jews are obligated to always give the non-Jew the advantage for the sake of peace. Don't coin clip. Don't cheat non-Jews. Now, does that mean no Jew ever cheated a non-Jew? Obviously not. If you have a rule against something, it's because it exists. But the authorities are saying, look, you're endangering us when you do these things. It's not just a question of bad business practice. This is a strategic problem. And then there's something called ethnocentric expressive hostility. Ethnocentric expressive hostility. What is that? I'll give you an example. Hasidim say that the election of Stanisław August Poniatowski as the King of Poland in 1764 was the result of a debate between two Hasidim. Who made Stanisław the king? We did. Or, take another example. There's a classic legend that there was a Jew who was the king of Poland for one day. You know who that was? Good thing you came today. Shaul Ba'al. Shaul Ba'al. Saul Ba'al. King of Poland for one day. What day was that? Well, when the king, Stefan Batory, died in 1585, according to the legend, the Poles could not decide who should be king. Well, you can't leave a country without a king. So they took Shaul Ba'al, who was the king's Jewish courtier, advisor, financier, and they said, okay, Shaul, you be the king. Temporarily. Now, Shaul knew a Jew can't be a king of Poland. So what did he do? He immediately started negotiations among all the nobles who should be the new king. At the same time, he signed various privileges for the Jews to make sure the Jews would be secure. So in one day, Shaul managed to arrange for the new king and secure the Jews' future in Poland, and then he had done his job, he went his way. Super day. Now, this is obviously a fairy tale. First of all, it's not true that there could be an interregnum in Poland. When the Polish king died, the Archbishop of Poland, the Archbishop of Gniezno, automatically became the interrex, the temporary king. There was no debate about it. Automatically. And then the new king was chosen by election of the nobles, which took place a couple of months afterwards. In addition to which, we have the records, volumina legum, the records of the Sejm, the Polish Sejm. There's not a word about any of this. So this is a fairy tale. On the other hand, Shaul Ba'al did live. He did live. He was a real person. He was an advisor to the three kings. He was an important person. What does this story tell you? That the Jews want to count. The Jews want to be part of the political process. The Jews want to say, oh, you think we're weak. You think we don't have any power. You think we're nothing. Guess what? We chose your king. Ha, ha, ha. That's ethnocentric expressive hostility, where the ethno group imagines that it's more powerful than it is. You know the story about the man on a train